Welcome, everybody, and depending on where you are in the world today, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We're in for a special session today featuring speakers from all over the world joining at all sorts of times of the day. Today's discussion and session is around the topic of competing worldviews concerning Korean reunification. How much will they be a factor in the outcome? We have an esteemed group of panelists today that I will briefly introduce. And before I do that, I want to remind all of our audience members that we have an interpretation option available. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a world icon. And if you click on that, you can choose the appropriate language for you. We have interpretation both in Russian and English. And one of our speakers will be speaking in Russian today. So I encourage you to go ahead and open your interpretation and turn on your English interpretation at this time. So we have 5 amazing panelists joining us today. First, we have Honorable Dr. Yevgeny Kim, who is the leading researcher at the Center for Korean Studies at the Institute of the Far East at the Russian Academy of Sciences in Russia. We also have Mr. Michael Breen, who is an author, commentator from South Korea, and is also the CEO of Insight Communication Consultants. He was the former president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club. We have Mr. Torbjorn Ferrevik, who is a historian, journalist, and author, and a specialist on East Asia coming to us from Norway. And we have Dr. Thomas Ward, who is the president of the Unification Theological Seminary in the United States. And finally, we also have Mr. Bruce Klingner, who is the Senior Research Fellow for Northeast Asia in the Asian Studies Center from the Heritage Foundation and the United States. Welcome to all of our panelists today. I'm looking forward to a great session. First, we're going to hear from each of our panelists who will speak for 7 to 8 minutes, and then we will open up our group to Q&A and discussion together. So throughout the presentations today for our audience members, if you have questions coming up, please go ahead and use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's 2 chat box windows next to each other that says Q&A, and you can type your questions in there. We'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible today. So for our first speaker today, I would like to welcome Mr. Michael Breen. Mr. Breen is an author and commentator on Korean issues based in South Korea and is a graduate of the University of Edinburgh. Mr. Breen is a former correspondent for the Washington Times and The Guardian and the past president of the Seoul Foreign Correspondents Club. He is currently the CEO of Insight Communications Consultants, a business consultancy in Seoul. He also writes for the Chosun Ilbo and the Korea Times newspaper. He's an author of 4 books on Korea, the most recent of which is The New Koreans. He was made an honorary citizen of Seoul in 2001. Mr. Breen, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaeleigh, and hello, everybody. I'd like to talk about the question of values at the heart of this issue of Korean reunification. It's sort of a subject we don't often touch, but I think it's very important. And as I was preparing for this, I was reminded of a press conference I attended in Seoul in the wake of German reunification about 30 years ago. And at that press conference, a South Korean journalist asked the West German or the new German ambassador if he thought that the 2 Koreas would be allowed by foreign powers to reunify as Germany had. And the ambassador said, you will not need permission. No country can object to Korean unification, he said. And then he added rather mystically, explaining his reason. You see, excuse me, something's just come up on my screen. There we go. He said, you see, we Germans were divided because of our sin, and you Koreans were divided because of your innocence. And that's why foreign powers have no moral basis to object to your unification. And there's a lot to sort of dig out in that comment, but the part that's always interested me, living out in Korea, is how it underscores the prime role of the Koreans themselves in their own reunification. If foreign powers have no morally acceptable argument to block their reunification, then it's up to the Koreans to do it themselves. And as they haven't, then it logically follows that they don't want to, at least not yet. And what I mean by this is that, of course, reunification is important. Both sides say they want it, but there must be something that's more important to them. And as to what this is, I think the answer is quite obvious, but as is the way with political things, the deeper that an assumption is planted, the less likely it is to be articulated. And we need to be clear about these things, however, because unarticulated assumptions lead us to act at cross purposes and to misunderstand one another. And that thing I'm talking about that I think is more important than reunification for the Koreans is national values. So what do I mean by this? Simply, I mean those things that a community places most value on. What is most important for us? For example, in secular democracies, we tend to place greatest value on family, the quality of our lives, freedom of religion, freedom of thought and expression, opportunity, fairness, the right to vote, our trust in institutions, our trust in our neighbors, and so on. These all matter more to us than some political arrangement. Or to put it another way, we want our political arrangements to be structured so that they protect us and make it possible to have those things that we value. So in this picture, in this scheme, if you like, the reunification for the Koreans seems like a lofty vision to aspire to. But I would say that in this context, it's not an end in itself, it's a means to an end. It's not the vision, but it's the strategy to reach the vision of a state with a system that embodies and protects the values that they cherish. Now, this may seem like a fussy point, it may even seem a little bit flaky in a sense, particularly if you take at face value what Koreans say about being one blood and one history and one language and all of that. But the truth of the matter is that political unity is not a matter of race, language, or shared history. The North Koreans and the South Koreans remain apart because they have conflicting values. And reunification in such circumstances can only happen by force. So what are the values of these rival Korean states? Let's take North Korea, for example. Unlike other communist revolutions, which were conceived as internal class struggles and which swept away the past, Kim Il-sung's revolution in North Korea was anti-imperialist. It involved not sweeping away the Korean past, but liberating it. And that's why their philosophy of self-reliance, juche in Korean, essentially is a way of saying up yours to foreigners. To sustain his revolution, Kim said, the North Koreans need a strong leader. And as a result, in North Korea, the leader is the state. The person of Kim Jong-un, the grandson of the founder, is more important than all of the nation's institutions and symbols. And this state of his values obedience, loyalty, and the collective over the individual. And enough people buy into this to keep the system in place. South Koreans couldn't be more different. Their values are those of modern democracies: freedom, justice, rights, equal opportunity, primacy of the individual, and so on. And you might assume, as Koreans are nationalistic, that love of country is a value. This is true, but the South Koreans are split on their concept of the country. It's useful to bear in mind that this is the main issue that separates the democratic right and left in South Korea. The right is loyal to the Republic of Korea, formed in 1948, and sees the eventual reunified state as an expanded version of their country. The left is loyal to a Korea that has its roots in the struggle against Japanese colonial rule, and this nation is still in the womb and is yet to be born. As for other stakeholders, well, I'll let, I see Kaeleigh has popped up, so I've only got a minute to go. I'll let other speakers talk about other stakeholders, but just one point, I think the values of other stakeholder countries, I think, are less important than their interests, which I think other speakers will talk to. And just very, very quickly, let me conclude by saying I have two recommendations, two steps. One is that in talking about Korean unification, we identify the desired vision. This is a no-brainer. That vision is for a unified Korea that's a law-based democracy with a free market economic system. So we have to reject the North Korean system, and we have to reject any fantasies about a hybrid system. Step two is to expand that vision to include the region of Northeast Asia. So America and its allies should articulate this vision of a region whose countries are law-based democracies with free market systems. And step three is where strategy and tactics come in, and we can argue about this. I say we tie down the North Koreans in all kinds of talks and exchanges, not because they'll lead to unification, but because we need to distract them and stop them misbehaving. And then we need to wait for the power shift that will lead to the change in values that will create the conditions for real reunification. Thank you. Sorry for going over time.
No, thank you so much, Mr. Breen. That was excellent, good timing, and very intriguing points, especially this last one about widening the net to include Northeast Asia in this whole conversation. Thank you for representing the Korean perspective as an honorary citizen of South Korea. Thank you. Now we're going to move on to our next panelist, Dr. Yevgeny Kim. Dr. Yevgeny was a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR, chairman of the steering subcommittee, and member of the Committee on International Affairs, the deputy chairman of the Committee on the State Building, and assistant to the deputy of the State Duma. In the IFES since 2003, Dr. Kim can often be seen on various federal channels as an expert on the Korean Peninsula and is currently the leading researcher at the Center for Korean Studies in the Institute of the Far East at the Russian Academy of Sciences. Thank you, Dr. Kim, for joining us all the way from Russia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone so that I can participate in this webinar. And I should say that now the ideas that now Mr. Michael Breen actually spoke of, I've been thinking as well. So before I begin, I would like to express my personal point of view on the main topic of our discussion. And I would like to know that 28 years ago, in 1993, actually, I had a chance to speak in Seoul to the participants of one seminar of the members of the Consultative Committee for the Peaceful Democratic Unification of Korea, which is a constitutional body formed by the President of the Republic of Korea. And at that time, I said that there are hopes that, well, okay, Kim Il-sung dies and the North Korean regime collapses and the country's rapid unification takes place are not feasible because the North Korean regime will not collapse until its own Gorbachev appears there. I also said that there will be no unification of Korea for at least the next 30 years. In 2011, after the death of Kim Il-sung's son, chairman of the State Defense Committee, Kim Jong-il, I also said that the DPRK regime would not fall. I can also say today that there will not be a unification of Korea in the next 15 or 20 years. Why? Neither the Republic of Korea, ROK, nor the United States, nor the DPRK have a basis for unification, and there is no correct strategy for unification. Well, I don't know how many more years I will live, but as I said, my opinion is that in next 15-20 years, most likely there will not be unification of Korea, unfortunately. So, about the strategy for unification. There is no basis for unification because ideologically and politically the regimes of the Republic of Korea and DPRK are antipodes, and they will not be able to agree on the socio-economic, political, moral principles of the future United States. In addition, both countries actually had a war, and there is blood on both hands from both sides, and this is a big problem. And it finally ended up in the two states which are completely antipodes in the ideological way. So this is one side. Then the unification strategy implemented by the Republic of Korea envisages, no matter how it is denied, the absorption of North Korea by South Korea. And in this, the strategies of the Republic of Korea and the United States coincide. At the same time, if the Republic of Korea is in favor of coexistence with North Korea for a certain period, then the United States proceeds from a strategy of destroying not just regime, but the DPRK state itself. The task is not realizable either now or in the foreseeable future. Moreover, South Korea considers a military political alliance with the United States to guarantee peace in Northeast Asia, and as well as the unification of the two Koreas, although the Republic of Korea is now categorically opposed to the military method of unification. From the side of North Korea, the unification is presented only as a creation at best of some amorphous form in the form of confederation with two independent Korea states with different political and socio-economic systems, independent from each other. It may be the beginning of rapprochement and unification, but not unification itself. The confederation is a rather loose association and can, and most likely can, disintegrate. The question arises what to do, what ideas, principles can help unification. Can religion help? On the Korean Peninsula, the existing world religions cannot become the main force of unification, if only for the simple reason that there is no religion uniting society in South Korea, and North Korea is an atheistic state. Nationalism could be a unifying force. Nationalism is quite strong in both Koreas, but nationalism in the Korean states has different vectors of development. In addition, it must unite people living in different states who have different allies, different vectors of development, which is practically impossible. By different vectors of development, I mean that the so-called democratic and authoritarian world. As you know, now certain political forces have announced the rallying of the democratic world in the struggle against the authoritarian world. ROK and DPRK in this sense belong to different worlds. However, democracy often leads to the fragmentation of society and not to cohesion. Then what ideas and ideals can unite? Maybe a new religion, but the emergence of the new world-class religion was only possible during the period of slavery and feudalism. Now there is neither one nor the other one. A post-industrial digital society is unlikely to be able to create a new world-class religion, and at the national level, this is difficult to implement, although the possibility of the emergence of such religions cannot be denied. It is possible that customary law will help. In the case of both Koreas, there could be the ideas and norms of Confucianism, especially since in two parts of the Korean Peninsula, the norms of Confucianism are quite stable and largely regulate social relations. But this too is still a reflection, not a reality, because South Korean society is moving further away from Confucian norms and moving toward Protestant morality. You can try to find a common language with calls for human rights, but this also cannot be done because North Korea perceives any attempts to deal with human rights in this country as interference in internal affairs. And these human rights themselves are now, in many cases, in conflict with the fundamental norms of democracy. For example, any democracy actually as the rule of the people is the rule of the majority. Therefore, most likely it is necessary to look for ways to unite Korea, not in some ideological and political concepts and strategies, but to go bit by bit, establishing cooperation in the field of economy, trade, and then in economic cooperation. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. I apologize for the delay there, but we wanted to make sure we heard the translation of your full speech. Very interesting points, taking the stance that reunification has a lot of challenges and in your view may not happen in 10 or 15 years. So really bringing to light the reality and the challenges of these two very different areas. So thank you, Dr. Kim. We are going to head over to Norway now to welcome Mr. Torbjørn Færøvik. Torbjørn Færøvik graduated with an MA in the Chinese history and has specialized in that area for most of his professional life. He served for over 25 years as a foreign correspondent and worked for many years as an international reporter for the Norwegian Broadcasting Corporation. He has authored 12 books on Asian history, including the biographies of Mahatma Gandhi and Marco Polo, and numerous other works, including 2, India in 1999 and Mao's Kingdom in 2012, that won Norway's foremost literary award, the Brage Prize. He currently works as a writer and freelance lecturer. Welcome, Mr. Færøvik. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, in the Chinese Forbidden City, Korea has been a source of concern for centuries. Koreans have tended to go their own ways without asking others for permission. In 1950, North Korea started a war, which in a sense is still going on. There is no peace agreement in sight, nor any reunification of the two Korean states. So why is it so difficult? There are many explanations. One is that China has lacked the political and military strength to impose its will. If the Chinese had tried doing so, there would have been a new Korean War with heavy losses and an uncertain outcome. Another reason is Beijing's lack of trust in their Korean comrades. The style of politics in North Korea has by and large been more dogmatic than China's, and unlike China, the country is virtually closed to outsiders. The present leader in the North does not have a high standing in Beijing, and in social settings, he is often the subject of more or less funny jokes and laughter. For some time after the Korean War, North Korea did better than its neighbor in the south. But then in the 1960s, South Korea's economy gained speed. After Chairman Mao's death in 1976, China was forced to look at the Korean problem with new eyes. It was all too clear that South Korea was an economic success, while North Korea was a failure. After several years of cautious warming up, the breakthrough between Beijing and Seoul came in 1992. That year, the two countries established normal diplomatic relations. Since then, trade between the two has risen year by year, and today China is South Korea's most important trading partner. And even though political problems arise from time to time, it seems that Beijing is willing to let trade run its course. There is no doubt that the Chinese leaders are impressed by South Korea's economic success. And as a sign that the Chinese leadership is placing great emphasis on relations with South Korea, President Xi visited Seoul as early as 2014, and a new visit is likely to take place soon. It is worth noting that Xi has not shown North Korea the same attention. His only visit so far took place 2 years ago. Although Xi and Kim Jong-un spoke highly of each other and toasted eternal friendship, it seems obvious that China's relations with North Korea are essentially dictated by military considerations, geopolitics, and duty. Yes, duty. DPRK, the Democratic Republic of Korea, was born thanks to China. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese fell on the Korean battlefield. One of them was the eldest son of Chairman Mao. Therefore, there are strong emotional ties between China and North Korea. Keeping North Korea afloat is in many ways a big burden for Beijing, but the Chinese leaders feel they have no choice. He and his colleagues hardly dare to imagine what might happen if North Korea collapses. In the worst case, millions of people will flee, most of them to South Korea, others to China. A complete collapse in North Korea would be a serious defeat for China, even more painful maybe than the US defeat in Vietnam. A North Korean collapse could also pave the way for a unified country leaning towards the US and the Western world. There are so many uncertain factors here, and Beijing's cautious men are not likely to take any chances in a game like this. It goes without saying that China wants a peaceful solution in Korea, but Xi is in no hurry. The most important thing for him in this phase is to keep North Korea's economy alive, to slow down or at best to halt the country's nuclear program, and to moderate Kim Jong-un and his close colleagues. There is, as you know, no Korean dialogue at present. The six-party talks, which began 18 years ago, ended after 6 years, and there is no light at the end of the tunnel. Relations between China and the US seem to be going from bad to worse, and without their active participation, there will be no movement in the right direction. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Vervik. Very interesting perspective, really looking at the situation of China, the power struggle that is happening there, and they're trying to hold on to North Korea while still having power over the DPRK. Very interesting. Thank you so much. We're going to move over to the United States now and welcome our next panelist, Mr. Bruce Klingner. Mr. Klingner is a distinguished graduate of the National War College, where he received a master's degree in national security strategy in 2002 He also holds a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the Defense Intelligence College and a bachelor's degree in political science from Middlebury College in Vermont. Mr. Klingner served for 20 years in the Central Intelligence Agency and Defense Intelligence Agency, including as CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea, responsible for the analysis of political, military, economic, and leadership issues for the President of the United States and other senior US policymakers. He is a frequent commentator in major American and foreign publications and a regular guest on broadcast and cable news outlets. He is currently a senior research fellow for Northeast Asia at the Asian Studies Center from the Heritage Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Klingner, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and someday, hopefully, again in person. The title of my topic is the Trilateral Alliance between the US, Japan, and South Korea. And actually, it's a misnomer because there is no formal military alliance amongst the three countries. Of course, there's dialogue, engagement, economically, there's military and security cooperation, but no actual alliance. So the relationship is triangular, but with two strong legs and one very weak leg. And the weak leg is between Seoul and Tokyo. The US has very good relations with both of our allies, but unfortunately the relations between our two allies has always been very strained. And indeed, Seoul has promised China that it wouldn't enter into a trilateral alliance with Japan after Beijing retaliated economically, after South Korea took steps to better defend its country and its populace against the growing North Korean nuclear and missile threat. Now, the strained relations are due to long-standing historic issues, centuries old, not just from the occupation by Japan of the Korean Peninsula last century. And the relations have been cyclical. They usually go from bad to very bad. And currently, they're the worst I've seen in the 28 years that I've been focusing on Northeast Asia. So the most recent iteration has been triggered by President Moon withdrawing from the Comfort Women Agreement, which was an accord that both countries thought had finally resolved the issue of the comfort women from World War II. Then South Korean court cases, then a Japan trade retaliation, South Korean threat to withdraw from the military and intelligence sharing agreement, et cetera. So, both sides point their finger of blame at the other, and at various times, both sides have been correct. In Japan, there's said to be Korea fatigue of that Japan feels it's done many apologies to resolve the historic issues, and South Korea keeps moving the goalpost. In Korea, there's Japan fatigue in that they feel Japan has not suitably apologized or taken steps to respond to its very brutal occupation of the Korean Peninsula from 1910 to 1945. In Washington, there's Korea and Japan fatigue. Right now, the US, or for many years, the US is trying to get our allies to focus on the present day threats from China and North Korea, rather than focusing on the threat from the last millennium. And quite simply, the US cannot defend South Korea without Japanese support. That's not only the 7 formally designated UN command rear bases that are in Japan, which provide support for any kind of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, but also the US would need access to other Japanese bases beside those 7 formally designated bases. And we need Japanese permission to use those additional bases. And we would also need Japanese military capabilities, protecting the sea lines of communication, not only from Hawaii and Guam to Japan, but from Japan to the Korean Peninsula, as well as Japan has very extensive mine clearing capabilities and other necessary capabilities during a conflict. And if bilateral relations between Tokyo and Seoul were very bad at the time of a conflict, Japan may decide not to assist or to allow its bases for UN operations on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea has repeatedly threatened Japan with nuclear attack. They've developed missiles and nuclear weapons that could annihilate Tokyo and other large cities. Pyongyang has engaged in military exercises where they've trained to do that, and they've announced that they were practicing nuclear airburst attacks on Japan. So if the relations between the two countries were bad, it would seriously impede not only the United States, but the United Nations from coming to the aid of South Korea during a conflict or potential reunification scenario. And South Korea has allowed these historic animosities to impede the current defense of its country and its populace on missile defense. And it has refused to allow its what's called the Korea Air and Missile Defense System to be integrated into the broader, the more effective allied system of the US and South Korea. It's like a baseball coach telling his three outfielders, I don't want you talking to each other. And anyone who's played baseball knows that the three outfielders have different perspectives on an outgoing high fly ball or a missile. And you may think you're about to catch the ball, but your colleagues will say, no, it's going to go over your head or it's going to drop short. So if the three outfielders are talking to each other, if their communication and their defenses are integrated, then you're more likely to catch the ball or intercept a nuclear tipped missile. But South Korea has refused that because of the very strong historic animosities, particularly from the occupation of the last century. So what is the role that the US could play? That has ebbed and flowed depending on the US administration. Under the Obama administration, the US was taking a very strong behind the scenes effort to send actually quite strong, stern messages to both Tokyo and Seoul to try to push their focus toward the current and the future threats rather than past threats from the previous millennium. Under the Trump administration, those efforts were largely abandoned. And we have yet to see whether the Biden administration will pick up where the Obama administration left off. The Obama administration's efforts did lead in part to the Comfort Women Agreement. And many of the people that were involved in that, Tony Blinken, Kurt Campbell, and others, are back in the Biden administration. So we're hoping that behind the scenes, the US will work and push and cajole our two allies to work better together so that we can better defend not only South Korea, but also Japan against the North Korean and Chinese threats, and also to work towards reunification. Now, I tend to focus on sort of the security aspects, the reunification or conflict on the peninsula. But even in a peaceful unification, if, say, the North Korean regime collapsed and we could have a peaceful unification, Japan would be a critical component because of its very large, very strong economy. South Korea couldn't pay for unification by itself. The debt and the poor economic conditions in the North are just too bad. So Japan, along with the rest of the international community, would be an obvious participant in any kind of rebuilding of the North Korean economy and country after a collapse. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Very interesting to paint the picture of this informal trilateral relationship, but particularly the responsibility of the United States to try to bridge the gap between these two nations in case of what may happen in the future, to prepare for that. So thank you, Mr. Klingner. We are going to move on to our final panelists for this, and then we will have Q&A after. And I want to remind our audience members to please use the Q&A function, not the chat function. It's a different button, the Q&A button, to be able to submit your questions for our panelists today. And now for our final panelists, I'd like to welcome Dr. Thomas J. Ward, who serves as the president of the Unification Theological Seminary and is a professor of peace and development studies. Prior to his current role, he served for 18 years as the dean of the University of Bridgeport's College of Public and International Affairs, where he taught graduate courses in culture and development, peace and conflict studies, and political and economic integration. Dr. Ward has lived and worked in the United States, Europe, Latin America, and East Asia. He lectures in English, French, and Spanish, and has a working knowledge of several other European and Asian languages. In 2008, he was appointed as a member of the Connecticut Department of Higher Education's Policy Advisory Council on International Education and served in that role until 2011. He has been a Fulbright Scholar, a Taiwan Foreign Ministry Research Fellow, and a guest lecturer at the Academy of Social Science in Beijing and at Academia Sinica's Institute of Modern History in Taipei. Welcome, Dr. Ward. We're excited to hear from you.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to begin with a key word, which is not part of my, my presentation. And the key word is ripening. And in any conflict, the point is that at some point, those involved in it, those engaged on both sides, they can come to the conclusion that somehow the struggle, the conflict is no longer worth continuing to pursue. We're reminded of cases such as Anwar Sadat, who suddenly made the decision to establish diplomatic relations to the shock of everyone with Israel. We're reminded of the deaths of Brezhnev, Yuri Andropov, Konstantin Chernenko, and suddenly the appearance of Mikhail Gorbachev. Quite simply, things can turn very quickly and in ways that we may not anticipate them to turn. So I just want to kind of preface it with that observation, and I'm certainly happy to explore it later if we have time. But I would like now to share my screen with all of you. I did not want to do that. I'll try this one more time. Okay. And my focus is to speak about the Universal Peace Federation and interstate relations in the North Asia Pacific region. Taming Intractable Conflicts, a text published by the United States Institute of Peace, speaks about the civil war in Mozambique, which lasted between 1976 and 1992, which took the lives of some 1 million people. And when things began to ripen in that particular conflict, the question came, who can be the mediator? Some thought maybe the United Nations, some thought Portugal, perhaps the European community, but none of those were acceptable to the two competing sides, Renamo and Frelimo. Instead, to the surprise of everyone, the consensus was that they would turn their attention to a small religious organization known as Sant'Egidio, which for many years had been performing different types of social services inside of Mozambique, and both felt this is a partner whom we can trust. And the amazing thing is that basically Sant'Egidio, kind of stepping back, providing a forum where the two parties could speak, somehow was able to serve as the vehicle through which in 1992, the General Accord for Peace could be established between Mozambique and between Frelimo and Renamo within Mozambique. So since that time, Sant'Egidio has been involved in the resolution of a variety of conflicts around the world. And my point today is maybe to suggest that it's possible likewise that an organization such as UPF can play a significant facilitating role in terms of the circumstances of the Korean Peninsula, as well as the breakdown of relations among some of the secondary actors in this conflict and with Korea itself. So I think that you are aware that UPF consists of a variety of organizations in areas such as government and culture and media and interreligious dialogue, and in the dimension of development per se, and also heads of state. But what I'd like to do, rather than trying to dissect those organizations in the little time that we have, is I'd like to provide a perspective on where the Koreas and secondary actors in this conflict hopefully can be able to go. Some of you might be familiar with this. This is called the curve of conflict. It was developed by Michael Lund from the United States Institute of Peace. There are different levels of conflict. Unfortunately, no time to talk about that today. Let me just differentiate between stable peace and durable peace. In a stable peace, for example, the relationship between the United States and Russia, there you can have trade, you can do a variety of things, but you know that there are certain things you can't talk about. In a durable peace, which is on the level of, let's say, US, Canada, we can speak about everything. So the idea is as conflict step by step dissipates, you want to get to the point of a durable peace, but it's rare, but that's the hope. I'm fascinated by France and the reconciliation that occurred after World War II between France and Germany. Some of you might know this statue. This is a statue which you find in Strasbourg. And it's a picture, it's a depiction of a mother with two sons, one who fought on the side of Germany and the other who fought on the side of France. And the interesting thing is that inscribed on this particular monument, you have the term mort pour la patrie, died for the country, without saying whether it was France or Germany. By the way, this was from World War I, this particular statue. But my feeling is that there's a remarkable model if we see the process and the change in Franco-German relations from the time of Nuremberg to the time of Lisbon. And I have to abbreviate everything here, but essentially, amazingly, between France and Germany, I think it's not an exaggeration to say that they're pretty close to having established a durable peace, having gone from war to a durable peace in this period of time. And so my question really is, what about the Koreas? Maybe some of you have seen this film, The Tokyo Trial, on Netflix. If you haven't, please watch it. It's 5 episodes, very well done, very insightful. But when one sees this particular trial, one still gets the sense that Japan feels that they were somewhat the victim of the circumstance and what transpired after the war. And if you visit the Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, you will find that there's a monument there to Judge Rahabadinod Pal, who was the Indian judge who did not agree that the prisoners of war that any of them should be judged as having committed war crimes. He did not concur with that. Korea-Japan relations on the Korea side also is not good. We already heard a little bit about that from Mr. Klingner, and the comfort woman controversy. By the way, I've written a book on that topic. I don't know how many people know, but in the United States, we have 15 comfort women statutes, everywhere from Washington, D.C. to Virginia, to New York, to New Jersey, to Texas, to Michigan, to California. And those particular statutes, they convey the narrative, if you will, of essentially the Koreans. And there's not much to be said about the Japanese side. I'm not saying that there's not issues that have to be brought up here and there are things that need to be settled. What I am saying is this is even in the United States, that we're only hearing one side of the narrative somehow. And I feel that this is one of the areas where UPF can make a huge contribution. When the comfort women controversy first came to light back in the early 1990s, it was around that time that Reverend Sun Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Ja Han Moon began a Bridge of Peace ceremony, bringing together Korean and Japanese women. They would cross a bridge, they would embrace each other, and they would establish a sisterhood. I'm sure that the intention behind that really was to work in order to improve this relationship. And incidentally, within the unification movement, there are more than 5,000 Korean and Japanese couples, which means children born from that who are both of Korean and Japanese origin. Again, I think they can be a great resource in terms of being able to somehow foster dialogue between Korea and Japan. Following the meeting between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in 2018, you may recall that that Korea canceled anti-US month. But they had actually done the same thing, canceled anti-US month in 1992 because of a Track 2 initiative initiated by UPF and Dr. Sun Myung Moon and Mrs. Hak Ja Moon. I was a part of that. There's not time to speak about it in this short period of time. But anyway, it was the first time that Anti-American Month goes from June 25th, the day when the Korean conflict began, until July 27th, the day of the armistice. And it happens every year. But in 1992, following Reverend Moon's visit there in 1991, and following a visit of a group of former American civil servants, public servants, a decision was made by the North Korean government to cancel this. Furthermore, Reverend Moon passed September 3rd, 2012. My point is he met Kim Il-sung in 1991, and between 1991 and 2012, there was exchange and somehow the channels of communication were kept open throughout that period of time. And on September 5th, at the time, 2 days after his passing, there was a flower arrangement sent to honor Reverend Moon, which was sent by Kim Jong-un. And on September 5th, Reverend Moon was declared a hero of national reunification on September 5th, 2012 by the government of the DPRK. He never renounced his values. He never renounced his principles. He never renounced his commitment. But at the same time, he was able to build a friendship. And I think that this is an important channel going forward, an important channel when the ripening moment comes to be able to begin to facilitate Korea-Japan relations and also North-South relations. And that tradition that was set up by Dr. Sam Young-moon has been continued by Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon up until today. So there is a channel there. There's a lot more that could be said about it, but in this brief period of time, I can't say too much. So my feeling is anyway that UPF is an important partner in this whole process of improving relations in Northeast Asia. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ward, especially representing the UPF perspective and point of view and how to support the reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Thank you. At this time, we're going to bring on all of our panelists to have a discussion together. We had a lot of questions coming in, and I noticed that Dr. Kim is doing an excellent job answering some of the questions that are coming in on the chat. So thank you for that, Dr. Kim. I'm going to start with Mr. Breen. So as you depicted during your talk today, the Koreans themselves resist unification because of their differing values. You pointed out that the values change over time, and near the end, you made some proposals of how to support this reunification. But can you think of ways that the two Koreas might move towards acceptance of such a common vision? What can be done there?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is, you know, there's been dialogue between North and South Korea for a long time now. Actually, it goes back to the early 70s when it began. But it has always, and it remains, basically on North Korean terms. When the North Koreans want to talk, we talk. When they don't want to talk, there's nothing we can do. You know, and being democracies, you know, Americans criticize whoever the president is for not doing the right thing, and the South Koreans criticize whoever their president is for being useless. But it's really the North Koreans who decide. And they've got themselves into an extremely difficult position. I mean, one thing about this Korean situation to bear in mind is this is a zero-sum game. These are two countries which both claim to be the real Korea.
Right.
And unless there's something really changes where they recognize one another, that is very, very different from two neighbors who don't get on. And so I think we all know what has to happen is there has to be a Gorbachev moment in North Korea, something that shifts them away from the hardline position that they're in. And I can't, frankly, I mean, it's possible Kim Jong-un will wake up one morning and have a revelation, but I can't see it. I think he's got to go. I can't see the grandson of Kim Il-sung really being our person to do this. So I think we sort of have to keep talking just to be nice. But as Dr. Kim said, this is going to take a long time, barring, as Tom Ward said, the unexpected event. And in these things, the unexpected event could happen anytime.
Yes.
Just for, you know,
Thank you.
If I may just
Sure.
add very briefly, I just reminded myself in 1992, I had dinner with 5 US diplomats and foreign journalists, and we all put a bet on when the date of unification, and we brought out $10 Korean money, plopped it down. I don't know who took the money. I don't know what happened to it. The most conservative person there was a South Korean journalist who bet April 1995.
Wow.
You know, so back then we all thought it was coming. We all thought this unexpected event would be around the corner. And here we are 30 years later making the same bet, and we might well be making it 30 years from now.
Thank you, Mr. Breen. I think Dr. Kim shares similar viewpoints in terms of when this may or may not happen. And Dr. Kim, can we also turn to you and ask you about the Russian point of view and perspective on North Korea? They once shared a communist ideology and now have different forms of government. What would you say is the perception of Russia by the DPRK now?
Kareigh.
Вы знаете, я хотел бы вместо последнего ответа на последний вопрос сказать
Instead of answering your question, I'm sorry, I wanted to say, also continuing the answer of Mr. Michael Breen. Why do you think every time the dialogue happens only when North Koreans want this dialogue to happen? Then the question is, why South Koreans cannot actually persuade North Koreans for some other way? I have good contacts with both North Koreans and South Koreans. Even though I am Korean, I have never lived for a long time in neither North or South Korea, but I spoke a lot with specialists there, and what they are talking about is that North Korea is the only country for a few hundred years of the history of Korea. Actually, North Korea is the only independent country for hundreds of years of existence of Korea in general. Now there is no even one foreign soldier in North Korea. No foreign teachings or anything. That's why they consider themselves to be really independent and real Koreans, so-called. And that is why their attitude to South Korea is very clear as the country which is not independent, which is dependent actually on the USA. Even when the president is speaking and showing many good points about his policy and the way how we can build the water the pipes, etc. But in order to even understand the level of or the state of the pipelines or the railroads, actually South Koreans had to get a permission from USA so that they can do that. And that's why North Koreans said, so how can we talk with you, South Koreans, if in order for you to come to North Korea and check this, the situation or the state of the railroad or pipelines or anything, you need to get a permission from USA. So how can we talk with you? That's why they don't have respect, like full respect to them.
Mm.
And this, I think, is very important to consider when we deal or think about inter-Korean relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kim. Very interesting culturally, the ideology and difference in terms of how North Korea views South Korea as not being true Koreans. Very interesting there. How about Mr. Fairvik? If you'd like to add any comments to this, you're welcome to, but also if you'd like to include the perspective of China. You mentioned, this slow, steady approach to dealing with North Korea from China, but would you characterize it as strategic patience, or is there some next step that may be happening from China? Oh, you're muted, Mr. Fejervik, if you could unmute.
That's it. Yeah. Many people, including myself, find it hard to understand why China hasn't been able to exert more pressure on the regime in North Korea. After all, China is vastly superior to North Korea. And the Chinese, they provide North Korea with everything from oil to soap. And in the last 2 decades, China has become a far stronger player in the international arena. The country's economy is said to be the second largest in the world, and its military capacity has become significantly stronger. But maybe, although this may be good for China, it has also caused anxiety and insecurity in many countries, especially in Asia and in the West, maybe also in North Korea. According to a recent survey by Pew Research Center, 76% of respondents in the US say they have a negative view of China. In South Korea, the percentage is 77%. And in Japan, it is as high as 88%. And I think these figures can be explained by China's failed international diplomacy in recent years. President Xi and his men are perceived by many as arrogant and unwilling to compromise on important issues, and especially China's behavior in the South China Sea. Well, it's just one example. And this deplorable development does not make it easier to establish a meaningful dialogue on Korea. So at some point, I think that China will have to adjust its course to reduce tensions in Korea, in the South China Sea, and elsewhere. I would also like to point out that China, in the years to come, it seems that the Chinese will have to focus more on the South China Sea and Taiwan. And as it is unwise to fight many battles simultaneously, a reduction of the tension in Korea would be to China's advantage. Whatever the case, North Korea armed with nuclear weapons doesn't serve China's interests in the long run. So, in my opinion, China has displayed a remarkable patience with the Kim dynasty, but I cannot explain why.
Very interesting. I see, Mr. Klingner, you have a comment to make. I was coming to you next anyway, so perfect timing. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. When some of the questions that have been raised in the chat room, ask, what can foreigners or the EU or others do to help bring about unification? In a way, we can't want unification more than the Koreans themselves. And a recent poll I just saw this morning has that only 26% of South Koreans are in favor of unification. 55% simply want to live peaceably side by side with North Korea, and many don't even think about North Korea. So what we've seen over the years is slowly decreasing support in South Korea for unification. I think it went below 50% during the Park Geun-hye administration, and it's ebbed and flowed, but generally it's been a declining support. It's generational. The largest support for unification is amongst the oldest generation, some who lived in North Korea before it became divided. Their families may still be there, though they haven't seen them in 70 years. the least support for unification is amongst the younger generation. They are more entrepreneurial. They're focused more on economic well-being, not only the country, South Korea's, but also their own. And they see unification would be very direly impactful on the South Korean economy as well as their own economy. So it's something that we all want to happen. I think any of us who have worked Korean issues, it's not only an issue in our mind, but it's in our heart. And we strive and hope for the unification of the Korean people. But unfortunately, there's declining support for it. Now, if there's a sudden collapse of the North, well, then of course, South Koreans would want unification. It's what I call the ugly baby on the doorstep syndrome. You may not want it, but once it's there, you of course would bring it in and take care of it. So there's unfortunately not a lot of positive movement towards unification at this point, as the other speakers have pointed out.
Mm. Well, Dr. Ward, I'm coming to you next to try to give us the positive outlook on what could be done to support this unification of the Korean Peninsula. I know you didn't get through all your points. If you want to expand a little bit on how you feel organizations like UPF can support it and are important, or if you have thoughts on some other options or alternatives to be able to bring about some type of unification of the Korean Peninsula.
Well, ultimately, decisions, they have to be made by governments. They can't be made by NGOs. Those are decisions which are finally going to be, they have to be done by government. So I think that what UPF is able to do is to keep open lines of communication, being a good listener, and at the right time, if something comes up, it'll be possible to do something. I know that in the past, many times people that I know who are associated with UPF, they've been consulted by the State Department. Well, how do you think how do you take this? How do you understand that? So I think that they can be a resource in that way, and basically, I think that I think another way, frankly speaking, is I believe that we can play an important role in terms of strengthening. It's a huge task, and I very much appreciate what Michael Breen said of outlining the scenario of the different camps inside of Korea itself, and also what Mr. Klinger said about the weakness of the relationship between Korea and Japan. But I think that's an area where we can also help. The reality is, the United States is a democracy which respects rule of law, as does Japan, as does Korea. If there's not a unity among those three, and India as well, then we face some real difficulties, because there is a voice for rule of law inside of China, but there's another voice which seems to be the resounding voice nowadays, which is much more emphasizing the party. We can do what we can to facilitate relations so that somehow Korea, Japan, and the United States can have a more cohesive voice for democracy, for rule of law. And I think that's a very important role that we can be able to play in terms of this process. At the end, finally, the ripening will happen because of some kind of change, either long-term or hopefully short-term. There'll be some type of a change, and we have to be ready to take advantage of that. And that's why it's important for UPF to keep its channels open.
Right. Yes, we've mentioned a few times in our session today the possible event or moment where we have to be able to move quickly should it happen. So we're coming to the end of our session today. I'm going to come to each of our panelists for your concluding remarks, again, on this topic of competing worldviews concerning Korean reunification and how much they will be a factor in the outcome. If you can try to keep your remarks to 1 minute, as we'll try to end on time. I know that's difficult, but we'll come to you first, Mr. Breen, your concluding remarks. Oh, please unmute yourself, Mr. Thank you.
Okay, I've unmuted there. Oh dear, I've got to keep to 1 minute. All right. Let me make a slightly different point that I hadn't made before then, in that case. What I think is more important than pushing on unification of Korea, particularly as we're outsiders in a way, is reconciliation between the two Koreas. We often use the words peace and unification in the same phrase. We want peace and unification in Korea. These things are in a sense, mutually contradictory while there isn't peace and unification. For example, what I mean by that is that unification is an inherently aggressive policy. Unification means your side is going to disappear. That's what it means when I was talking about the values, you know, this is what it means. We do not want North Korea any of your values. And they say, we don't want any of yours. So when one side starts saying, oh, we want to talk about unification, the other side checks their defenses. You know, what are they up to? But reconciliation is a different thing. You know, I live in Seoul. Actually, you talked about the Comfort Women statue. My office is right by that. I go past that every day. I'd like to be able to drive up to Pyongyang and have dinner there. You know, that sort of level of reconciliation, exchanges, freedom of movement, and things like that, and eventual peace. To me, that's the first step. And that's not impossible. So I'd like to leave you with that thought. Thanks.
That's great. Really fantastic, maybe more realistic next step to consider. How about Dr. Kim? What are your concluding remarks for today's session?
Вы знаете, я
A few years ago, for 3 years, I had conferences between North Korean, South Korean, and Russian scientists. And actually, all of them, they could understand each other very well. So that's why I think what we can really do at this moment for Korea and for the unification is to help Koreans to have connections with each other on the level of academicians or some other levels. You know, South Korea, in fact, actually cannot fulfill its own agreements which they had signed. For example, President Moon Jae-in in 2090 said that this year we will restart the work of the industrial center, and he really wanted this, but they couldn't do it. And in many ways it was because of the foreign push or foreign involvement. So that's why we really need to let them to have more trade between each other without foreign influence. Of course, we need to have a lot of patience for this, but I think this is necessary. Thank you.
Very interesting. Yes, similar to some of the other thoughts shared today, that let the Koreas work on it amongst themselves too. Thank you, Dr. Kim. How about Mr. Fairvik?
Yeah, I think when we discuss Korea and the prospects for peaceful reunification, it's important to say a few words about the cult of personality in North Korea, because when an ordinary human being like Kim Jong-un is elevated to Superman, to a godlike figure, any rational political discussion becomes impossible. Superman decides. And in such a culture, there is little room for compromise because Superman cannot be wrong. He has seen the light and therefore chosen his course, and he will stick to it. And everything else is a loss of face. The personality cult in DPRK began with Kim Il-sung, and it has continued to this day. And the international communist movement has a long tradition of personality cult, but North Korea stands out as a special case because it has been going on for so long and because it is so absurd and harmful. And I think an important precondition for the cult is that part of the population is willing to keep it up. And in the DPRK, there is, under the current Kim, a political elite that enjoys significant economic privileges due to his rule. So if the country is reunited, this elite has no guarantee that life will continue as before. The cards will be dealt again, and many people will experience a sharp drop in status and power, and Kim Jong-un will for certain lose his exalted status and join the ranks of normal people. So this is why it is so difficult to imagine a reunification of Korea under the current regime in the north, simply because Kim and company has too much to lose.
Right. Right, very good points. Thank you, Mr. Farovic. How about to you, Mr. Klingner?
The longstanding U.S. policy on reunification is that it's a matter for the Korean people. We hope it takes place under the precepts of Article 4 of the South Korean Constitution, that it's based on the principles of freedom and democracy, which exist in the South and don't exist in the North. In the meantime, the U.S. military presence there, the alliance, the commitment to deter and defend South Korea, the alliance is playing sort of the same role as that I play as an overprotective father of a young daughter. It's fine for the Koreas to talk to each other. It's fine for the Koreas to go on dates together and perhaps eventually get married. But we'll be walking 3 steps behind them with a shotgun to make sure one Korea doesn't try to take advantage of our Korea.
You have some great analogies, Mr. Klingner. That was excellent. Thank you. And finally to you, Dr. Ward, your closing remarks.
Well, I think one area where UPF actually can be quite useful is giving some further thought to, there's this delicate balance: nuclear weapons in North Korea and human rights violations by the Kim regime. A decision has to be made about how that will be navigated going forward. You know, you can't have both. You can't think, okay, first of all, we're going to take care of the nuclear weapons, and then we're going to deal with the human rights issue. I'm quite certain that that's not going to happen. You know, so really, UPF is a right place to think about those types of issues and to make recommendations behind the scene about how best to proceed to get to where we want to go, because the reality of a nuclearized North Korea, which is so unstable, is a huge threat for all of us. We just have to recognize that. It's a huge threat for all of us.
Right, it really is. And that's why this conversation is an important one. I want to thank all of our panelists today. I know we could go on for another hour, but this was a very intriguing conversation. Thank you for your expertise and your time and your perspective. We're very grateful to it. And thank you to our audience members. I apologize we weren't able to get to all of our Q&A today, but hopefully we can reconvene at another time. Thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day, afternoon, or evening, whatever it is. Take care.